Welcome back. You're watching another episode of Context with me, Dilek Tuna, and today we have another closer look at Ukraine-Russia relations as well as the US-Ukraine mineral deal. Now, in a pivotal development on the 18th of April 2025, the United States and Ukraine signed a memorandum of intent in Paris, laying the groundwork for a sweeping economic partnership agreement. The accord opens the door to greater US access to Ukraine's vast reserves of critical minerals, such as graphite, lithium, titanium, and uranium, resources that are increasingly vital to clean energy technologies, defense systems, and digital infrastructure. The deal, signed during a high-level visit by Ukrainian officials, also proposes the creation of a joint reconstruction investment fund aimed at funneling international capital into Ukraine's war-hit economy. Though still in its early stages, the agreement signals a long-term strategic commitment by Washington to not only support Ukraine militarily, but politically, but to anchor it firmly within a Western economic framework. Negotiators from both countries are working to finalise the technical aspects of the partnership by the 26th of April, with Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal expected to travel to Washington next week to cement the next phase. The timing of this pact, coinciding with stalled peace talks and shifting global supply chains, adds weight to its geopolitical significance, positioning Ukraine as a key partner in securing critical raw minerals for the West. Joining me now to discuss this further is Steve Gill. He's the senior legal partner in the Preston Gill Group in Nashville, Tennessee. Steve, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Now, how significant is this memorandum in terms of US efforts to secure supply chains for critical minerals amid growing tensions with China?
I think it could be incredibly significant, but keep in mind that President Zelensky of Ukraine has agreed on at least 4 or 5 occasions to do a similar minerals deal and has balked whenever it came time to actually putting pen to paper. So I think it's a move in the right direction that apparently a deal has been struck, but call me skeptical until I see President Zelensky actually sign the deal. Now, if it does happen, I think the idea of security in Ukraine as a condition that President Zelensky was requesting is guaranteed with business security, not necessarily military boots on the ground security. If U.S. interests are on the ground in Ukraine, if construction is being done, if prosperity is being brought to bear, I think the U.S. obviously has a strong interest in preserving the peace, and I think that's all a very good step in the right direction. Not only the U.S., not only for the global economy, but certainly for the people of Ukraine.
And can this agreement realistically reduce America's dependence on foreign adversaries for strategic raw materials?
You know, part of the issue, I think, with these, exotic minerals and the rare earth minerals is not just the mining of them and obtaining them. It's then turning them into the materials you need, the processing, and again, until you have the refineries, until you have the mechanics of converting those minerals into the stuff you're trying to produce, you really have another step to go. But the first step, whether it's obtaining them in Africa or in Ukraine or anywhere else, is to get access to the materials and then start the process of refining them and turning them into the goods and materials that you're really seeking, whether it's for military purposes or for technological purposes, for cell phones.
And Steve, from a legal standpoint, how binding is this memorandum of intent, and what hurdles remain before it becomes a fully ratified partnership?
Intent's always an interesting word. I mean, they intend to finalize the deal, but there's an old American saying that probably translates well into the world: the devil is in the details. So once the framework of an agreement is reached, then you get into the difficulties of exactly what else has to be done and put into an agreement. I think we're seeing some of the same thing with these tariff disputes around the world. It's one thing to agree in principle, but then you have to start agreeing to what are the tariff and non-tariff barriers, what are the other details that take time to be put together, which is one of the reasons that the pause that President Trump announced on imposing tariffs for 90 days, the EU agreeing to the same thing, is not because either side is really backing off. It's because it does take time for the lawyers God help us, we have to put lawyers into the process at some point to work out the actual dirty details, and that can take some time, and that's where deals often fall apart.
Okay, and how does this proposed investment fund align with broader US objectives for Ukraine's post-conflict reconstruction?
Well, I think, again, if you want to move Ukraine into the prosperity arena instead of the conflict arena, you got to have resources. You have to have investment. And I think whether it's rebuilding the areas that have been bombed out and destroyed in Ukraine, whether it's building out and doing a similar type deal with the U.S. and Russia for the eastern portion, the Donbass, Donetsk, Luhansk, Mariupol, those regions will need the same thing. I think you're going to see the Trump administration follow up pretty quickly with a similar type deal, maybe relieving sanctions, starting the reconstruction process in those areas as well. So I think that it'll be on both sides of this conflict. And again, if we're focused on prosperity and business rather than bombs and bullets, that is a good sign, not just for Russia and Ukraine, but for the whole region and frankly for the rest of the world.
Okay, and could this pact be interpreted by Moscow or Beijing as a provocative move? And if so, what are the potential diplomatic consequences there?
I think it still comes down to territory. I mean, you've had the U.S. envoy Witkoff talk about 5 different regions of eastern Ukraine, including Crimea, that moved into the Russian Federation a decade ago. You still have to deal with the territory. I just completed with my law partner a piece focused on the fact that under Ukrainian constitutional law, any agreement to give up territory requires a referendum under Ukrainian law, which means the people of Ukraine will have to vote on this resolution. And right now, as long as President Zelensky has the country under martial law that prevents a presidential election, it probably prevents the referendum that would lead to the diplomatic solution. So there are still a lot of complications ahead. And part of that is that Ukrainian law may make it hard to reach a diplomatic resolution as long as President Zelensky controls the executive order that maintains martial law in effect that prevents elections.
And are US companies ready to invest in Ukraine's mining and energy sectors given the ongoing security risks there?
I think the security risks decline once a deal is reached, but it has to be reached on both sides of the aisle, both with Russia and with Ukraine. And again, a diplomatic resolution agreeing in what President Trump's envoy Witkoff is seeking is going to be crucial before companies will really want to invest too much in terms of materials and manpower, with still the risk of conflict and perhaps even rogue elements trying to blow apart the deal, no pun intended. So I think we're at a difficult time, but at a prospectively good time in terms of the resolution of this conflict. I know President Trump wants to end it. I believe President Putin wants to end it. I think there are certainly those in Ukraine who want to end the conflict with the carnage in terms of the number of bodies that have been dead or injured. It is time to end the carnage, and hopefully this step towards prosperity will lead to actual peace.
And how might American taxpayers respond to the idea of jointly financing Ukraine's economic recovery through a bilateral fund?
I think the key is that if the funds are not coming from taxpayer dollars in the U.S., but instead coming from the minerals, coming from the resources that will be developed, those funds being used to both repay the U.S. and the taxpayers for the $100 or $200 billion that has been spent in the conflict, combined with using those dollars to rebuild Ukraine, I think will be something that American taxpayers would embrace. I think that American taxpayers have come to the end of their rope in terms of continuing to write blank checks to the Zelensky regime, and I think that's what is going to help push this to a conclusion. The money spigot from the U.S. is coming to an end, and they have to find other sources of money. I don't think that the frozen Russian assets are going to be a viable option, since that would be in violation of international law. But if the resources of Ukraine can be further developed, can be put into the process, that's going to be the source of funds that I think relieve the burden on American taxpayers, but also lead to the reconstruction and growth in prosperity in Ukraine. I think what the Ukrainians need to want is not just an end to the conflict, reconstruction of the damage that's been done, but building an infrastructure of prosperity that can lead to, a generation or two of financial gain. And I think that's going to be what's going to bring people back to Ukraine who fled the country because of the conflict. They've got to believe there's a future in Ukraine, and the reconstruction is part of that, but a future of prosperity is going to be just as critical.
And does this deal mark a shift in US foreign policy away from direct aid and towards long-term economic entwinement?
I think that's going to be the focus of the Trump administration, certainly for the next 3 years, of looking for not just, writing a check in terms of aid, much of which gets diverted through fraud, through waste, through abuse of the system. Donald Trump is a business guy. He wants to see results. So return on investment is going to be a focus, not just, paying people, whether it's here in the U.S. or abroad, without producing results. So I think it is a change from U.S. policy in the past, but I think it's going to be a more dependable, a more understandable and rational policy than what we've seen in the past, particularly, again, as the Department of Government Efficiency has discovered. The fraud and the waste in the U.S., the billions and hundreds of billions that have been lost here, have been the same thing globally, where money has gone with no result, no benefit to the people that were supposedly receiving the funds to aid them. And I think that is a dramatic change, which is one of the reasons that you're seeing those who may have been prospering, who may have been the beneficiaries of the corruptness of that kind of policy in the past. That's why they're screaming and howling and pushing back. But that's the path we're going to see, I think, for the next 3 years under President Trump.
Okay. And what mechanisms are being put in place to ensure transparency, accountability and anti-corruption in the implementation phase?
I think that's another of the details that I was talking about. Ukraine has been one of the most corrupt regimes in the world, and not just involving the Biden family and Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. President Zelensky has dismissed dozens of his own senior officials because of corruption during the course of the last 3 years. So where the money goes, accounting for how it gets spent, is going to be a critical element. And I used to tell my clients in the law business all the time, I'm a good lawyer, but I'm not good enough to keep you from being cheated by someone who is determined to cheat. You can't put enough documentation together to prevent somebody from cheating if that's their desire. So my admonition to clients has always been, don't do a deal with anybody that you wouldn't do a deal with on a simple handshake. Now, put it in writing, but if you don't trust them enough to do it on a handshake, you can't do it well enough in writing to prevent you from being cheated. So I think that's going to be the challenge in these details that are going to be worked out between this intent agreement and the final details. How do you prevent cheating? And that's going to be very difficult, unfortunately, I think, in Ukraine.
Okay, now, Steve, my last question to you. Could this agreement set a precedent for similar US arrangements with other resource-rich partners in conflict zones?
I think so. And you've already seen some of the African nations saying, hey, we've got these same kind of materials. Why don't you come in, provide protection in our country, provide assistance in our country, and we'll strike similar deals. I think you've already seen some backdoor discussions between President Putin and President Trump talking about similar transactions to bring Russia back into the commerce region of international diplomacy. Again, returning to talking and doing business is going to be the way that President Trump wants to do business. You're seeing him meet this week with President Meloni of Italy. He's meeting with the Milieu of Argentina. The personal diplomacy and the personal focus on business by President Trump is going to be a foundation that is going to certainly be in play for the next 3 years. And again, that gives a consistency, that gives a capability of people to determine how to deal with the U.S. rather than just having to guess. And I think that's going to be a positive transactional-based way of doing business that President Trump certainly intends to pursue. And I think as other countries see that as the best course, we'll see more of them lining up to come to Washington, meet with President Trump and his advisors, and get the business of business put at the top of the list.
Okay, Steve, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your contribution.
Thank you very much.
And that brings us to the end of another show, another context. Join us again for more programs. Thanks for watching.